the eternal child in us. I tend to say it's for people aged between 5 and 105. And it's an environmental fable. It's a love letter to trees, to nature. And it takes the story of a young girl who's 7 years old, and she has to go to the forest to find a flower that will help heal her mother, who's very sick. And in the course of trying to find this flower, she discovers something else, which is that the forest is dying. And the story really is the story of how she, goes from innocence of being a mere 7-year-old to being somebody upon whose shoulder it falls upon to save this forest. It's a story of courage. It's a story of, it's a love story, really, with nature. And about the links between nature and us. And as for Astonishing the Gods, it's a more complex story. It was first published in 1995. It's a story of a young man who discovers that he's invisible, though he can see his own people and his own people can see him, who sets out into the world to find the people who are visible, to see what they look like. He was curious about visibility. So he traveled to go and discover what the secret of visibility is. It really is a story that looks like more than it appears to be, because at its heart, it's really a story of the transfiguration of suffering into vision, really. But ostensibly, it's a tale of a surprising and maybe even a reverse discovery, where all the things that we think we know about ourselves and about our civilization are kind of turned on their head. And the fulcrum of this turning is the notion of visibility and invisibility. It's a kind of a fictional meditation on what it means to exist.
Beautiful, thank you. And Morowa,
Ben, I like that. I like that concept very much, because, people like to put labels on literature and, magic. They'll say it's magical realism, but really, what I like about some of the things you said, and also some of the things that I've read for sure in your work, is that blending of the natural world and the toughness of the circumstances that humans have to face. It's a blending, the invisible and the visible, the real and the unreal, the living and the dead. To me, it's all part of a whole piece. And literature is a great way to explore those different pieces and move in and out of them fluidly. And so that's one of the things I enjoy very much about the topics that you pick. The natural world really is, the breastplate for everything. We wouldn't be here without Mother Nature, and unfortunately, the earth is suffering. So I think that any story that especially blends how a child sees, there's no contradiction between what humans are doing and what nature needs, is really fascinating. I think children have a pure eye. So I love that it centers around a little girl. I tend to like to write through a child's eyes through some passages as well, just because there's less interference, I believe.
Well, in this case, I chose a child, or rather, the child chose me, because she seemed to me to be the perfect vehicle for this kind of journey, this kind of story of courage. Her youth, her extreme youth, because I did try when I was writing it to make her slightly older. It didn't work. It didn't work at 13. Didn't work at 14. Didn't work at 10. She kind of had to be something like 7. It just was on the very borders of improbability. And I think it's also because, you know, the environmental issues of our time have been caused by adults. We grown-ups, we're the ones largely responsible for it, us and our parents, and our parents' parents. And it's the younger generation, the very young, actually, who are taking up the mantle of doing something about it in a very visible and invisible way. So it really is also a kind of a celebration of that the courage of the very young in our times, and kind of support, really. And I take your point about the purity of the heart and purity of the spirit, which we tend to lose as we get older.
Yeah.
So I think this is a time when everything is a bit reversed. You know, as many of the great religions would say, as many of the sages would say, this is a time when the young teach the old what the most essential things are. Yeah.
Can we dive into that a little bit, actually? When you spoke about young people taking up the mantle for the sake of the future, that really had an impact. And the idea of the story being that this very young person, you know, the pure heart that we spoke of, is going into the forest and finds that the forest is dying. It puts me in mind of how young people are also at the forefront of the climate activism movement, and how young people are definitely, in a way, most impacted because it is the world that they will inherit. And if we can talk a little bit about that inheritance, you know, the inheritance of the world to young people, and what our material responsibilities are, but also our spiritual responsibilities as well to those people.
Well, our responsibilities, we've largely failed them, if I'm going to be honest with you. And so now all we can do is catch up. We just need to run faster and make as big a contribution as we can make with our voices, our votes, in our personal lives, in you know, the choices that we make at home, choices of composting where it's possible, of, you know, a more economical use of power, any form of power that depletes and corrupts our environment. It just seems to me to be one of the less talked about but more unavoidable things of our age. I mean, one of the reasons why this story got written was actually because growing up, I was very aware of the primacy, the richness, the abundance of the forests near us in Lagos and in the villages where I used to go visit my grandparents. You know, the forests were abundant. They were gods in themselves. They were the home of imagination. They were places of cultural and spiritual richness. They were the homes of storytelling. A forest was a proper experience. It was a world. And as I was growing up, I just noticed, without noticing that I was noticing it, that the forest was slowly diminishing. And in parts of Lagos, it disappeared altogether. Rivers became ribbons of water and then vanished, became dry land. And you go back to visit, and you go to look for this forest, and it's not there anymore. So it's this sense of loss that is also at the heart of the inspiration of this book. So in a way, it's a kind of secret elegy, as well as a cry of anguish, and a plea that we all respond to this with our hearts.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the other thing too, I wish, you know, the other thing I'd like to think about is the fact that if we could all just realize in the middle of this mess that the earth, you know, the earth doesn't need us to exist. We need the earth to exist. and so that dialogue that we can explore and that you explore with the girl and the trees, if we could get back in touch with talking to our earth or listening to our earth.
Listening, absolutely.
You know,
Listening.
I think
we talk too much to the earth.
we talk too much to the earth.
Yes, and too badly. I think it's time to listen. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, there's the absurd assumption that we can somehow save something that birthed us, that doesn't need us to move forward. You know, I think is a grave mistake that we've made generation after generation.
I think it's also the way in which we have wrongly interpreted myth, and the way we've wrongly interpreted passages in the great religions.
Yeah.
I think we have really misinterpreted the idea that we misinterpreted the idea that we are meant to take charge of the earth, that we are the owners and the exploiters of the earth, that we are masters of the earth. I think if you look at the text in their original form, we're gardeners.
Right.
We're meant to be co-inhabitors. We're meant to be co-creators. We're meant to be partners with the earth. We're not meant to be masters of the earth. I don't think we haven't learned how to be masters of ourselves, talk less of something much greater than us, which the earth is. So I think it's also about reading. Many of these things is got to do with how we read, how we interpret, and how we misinterpret, and then how we embody that misinterpretation. So if we have this idea that we're meant to be masters of the earth, then well, we can do anything we want to it. And it gives the impression that the earth is this inert thing that can just receive our doing without any consequences. Whereas the idea of a gardener of the earth is a co-relationship, is one of respect and nurturing, isn't it? It's one of friendship, even one of beauty. Thank you very much. That's the spirit. It's even one of aesthetics. I think that's the trouble with the literal interpretation of myth. It fascinates me as well. It's at the back of all my writings. Be careful about myths. You misinterpret them and you'll end up burning the earth underneath your feet.
Yeah.
On that subject, can we delve a little bit more into the sort of mythos that exists in your writing? In fact, both of you incorporate just a fresh respect for sort of mythology and for what stories mean and why we tell them to each other and to ourselves. And can you talk a little bit more about how that fits in and how that emerges in the work?
Morowa, do you want to go first on this? I can sense a desire to dance with this subject.
Oh, well, I think the natural world is something that's always been at the core of, I was one of those kids who was always fascinated by the universe and how things were formed. And as a child, I think all children hold that fascination for the natural world around them. I feel fortunate that I was able to hold on to some of that and harvest some of that in some of my writing. And then it comes to the fore when there's such a huge contradiction. Washington is a place of contradiction, and particularly Southeast Washington, where the story takes place in Creatures of Passage. It's very much of an urban setting, but then there's the natural world, huge gardens right next to it. I grew up spending the summers in my grandmother's garden, and she there was that contradiction of the beauty of this huge feral garden that she had, but then there might be a murder in the next block. There were police in the alley, you know, and I'm outside, I'm playing, and I'm thinking about all the things the children think about. And so, you know, that I'm looking at the birds flying by. I'm not thinking about, you
Bless
know,
you.
the helicopters, you know, the helicopters looking for somebody through the alleys. I'm looking at the birds, the strawberry patch she had, and not looking at the cruiser that was, you know, driving by in the alley adjacent to the strawberry patch. So there's a lot of contradictions that I think come to the fore. But beneath all of that, beneath the cement and the human exploitation, lies the earth, and it'll. I believe that regardless of how far we believe we can go uh, with the destruction of the earth, it ultimately leads to our own demise. I mean, the earth will destroy us before we destroy the earth. But I think that there's no need to have such a combatant relationship with nature. And children are the closest to that. They're not so, you know, they haven't been corrupted yet. They can still hear the earth and still appreciate it for what it is. So those are themes that I tend to enjoy to explore and find a way to have our own understanding of what was and what should be when it comes to our relationship on this planet.
Yes, for me, myth is you speak of mythos, and I'm just going to simplify it and go straight to myth. For me, myth is the secret essence that we have collectively squeezed out of our time on this planet. It is what we've distilled out of the combination of our stupidity and our wisdom. But for me, myth is also the deepest dialogue that we have with the universe, with nature, and with history. When we want to tell our children stories, when we want to make them understand their place in this universe and how they can affect it or enrich it, we tend to go to myths. And myths are very strange things. They for me, they contain the secret history of an entire people. You can take one myth and unpack it properly, and it would reveal all kinds of things which people would see as fragments of history, folded history, but which is much more than history. It's the greater wisdom of the race. So myth fringes my work because for me, myth and life are kind of deeply linked. And very early on, when people asked me about something like the Famished Road, I always used to say that what I wanted to achieve was to reveal the myth in life and the life in myth. Because it's this dialogue, this movement from one to the other that really constitutes the real story of our lives. However we live, whether you live a life of foolishness, a life of wisdom, a life of greatness, or a life of insignificance, you are weaving in and out of the territory of myth. Your life is myth touched at all times. It's completely unavoidable. Even if you just live in a coma and never get up and jump and dance and fall down and make a fool of yourself and stand up again, even if you're just in a coma, your life is still touched with myth. It's still weaving in and out of this extraordinary condition. So I'm fascinated by myth. There isn't anything that one can touch that isn't radiant with myth in some ways. And my stories always edge around the darkness of myth, the light of myth, and the mystery of it.
And it's a frequency, right? We can all hear it, wherever we are in the world. It's like stardust, and it comes to you when you're writing. Egyptology, the greatest, deepest well of storytelling comes to me when I'm writing. Those myths, there's variations down through the millennia of the same story, the human story. And I think those stories rise to the surface over and over again because they're kind of a current that we float on. And those of us who like to write, I think, can tap into that current of myth as a way to make sense of the past and the present and the future.
But I think apart from just writing, I think in our lives, touches some frequency of a mythic condition. People feel it. People feel it by a kind of a sense of a charge, a sense of a sort of a sudden access of meaning, of clarity, in some moment of their lives. I am fascinated by myth in cities for that reason, because people think that myth really belongs to more traditional cultures. And I keep saying to them, you can find myth in your motor car. You can find myth on your iPhone if you know how to look.
Yeah.
You can find myth in your computer. They ain't anything that isn't touched by its star radiance. So good question. Are you interested in myth yourself?
Yes, I definitely am. I'm not a published author, but when I do write, I tend to write from that perspective as well, just sort of that mythical surrealist perspective. And when you were talking just now, especially about how myth is interwoven in every part of life, even from the day you're born, I remembered suddenly a childhood memory of myself and my cousins standing outside on a clear sunny day, and we looked at each other and we said, "Do you want to make it rain?" And so we engaged in we made up a dance on the spot, and we're chanting and dancing together and moving. And then off in the distance, I could see just a sheet of rain approach us and overwhelm us. And it was such an intense and strange moment. So I feel that I absolutely believe that there is a hint of strangeness that touches every single part of everyone's life. And it's so beautiful to read and to talk with people who can see that too. And speaking of seeing and being seen, in Astonishing the Gods, we're talking about this very strange experience and something that could be horrifying and could be incredibly disconcerting, of not being seen or suddenly finding yourself invisible in the world and in your community. And can we talk a little bit about what that visibility represents to you as a writer, and what the emotional root of that visibility versus invisibility is?
Wow, that's another really big one. Goodness. I think visibility and invisibility are also myth-touched things. You go back as far as you want to the ancient Egyptians, and they were fascinated by invisibility. Their gods passed on the notion of invisibility and of its powers to the ancient Greeks. The Greeks passed it on to us. Invisibility and the gods, invisibility and power, invisibility and powerlessness, invisibility and divinity. I think our existence is a dialogue between these two things, but we have tended to lean more towards the visible. And I think it's maybe one of the darker gifts of science that we have compelled our questioning of the universe and of our discoveries towards the visible, towards evidence, and it has meant that which cannot be seen and that which cannot be compelled to be visible, we have slowly come to deem as not existing. And I think this has caused a real problem in our civilization. I think it's I think the visibilization of everything as a standard of truth has reduced our sense of our place in the universe. A universe which, I must add very quickly, is composed largely of the invisible, from its air to its vibrations, the things that we call electricity. Everything that we depend on is invisible. In terms of culture, visibility and visibility often change places. I grew up in a place where to be really powerful as a herbalist, as a medicine man, one of the highest things you had to prove was the capacity to become invisible. They used to have invisibility competitions between really powerful medicine men. This is just part of myth. Two people will compete, and one will say, "What is it you can do?" And I say, "Well, I can turn this thing into that." And what can you do? I can turn this to that. And one of the highest things was to render invisible. And yet, but by the same token, invisibility has in our time come to be seen as a somewhat weak and powerless condition. So I'm just trying to reverse, or at least to restore to invisibility something of its lost higher condition in our lives and in our culture. And also in our times, I think we're living in a time of kind of a toxicity of visibility, kind of arms race of visibility. I think we're driving ourselves crazy with visibility and the quest for it and all the different digital media, where we now come to think that our visibility in these spheres is actually more real than our presence, than our internal reality, than our authenticity and our truth. So there are many, many debates and discussions to be had about reversing the dialogue between visibility and invisibility. Do you feel this, Morowa?
I do, and I'm appalled by it, especially when we look at how what I call the lens is being controlled. The obsession with visibility is also the obsession with who's controlling the lens by which we look through something. And the preoccupation with calling something else, and somehow that makes it miraculously turn into that instead of what it always was. So the labeling as another vehicle of forced visualization on something. You exist because I'm defining you this way. And that's something that's certainly plagued Black people for years and years and years. And the constant struggle to redefine the lens, fix the distortion, and then all those things that are invisible, those intangibles, are the things that really do have the greatest impact. The things that are said when we're not in the room, those are the things that often impact us the most. It's just, I think it is important to get back to that balance between the seen and unseen. It's a way to understand something in a more holistic way, instead of, being stuck in this two-dimensional world that we're in now. And social media has only fanned that flame, where people have digitized identities that have nothing to do with who they are as people outside in the real world. And I would dare to say that it's fomenting a desire to shed how they are in the real world, and not nurture that, not develop those social relationships, and embrace this digitized identity and reality that's really fragmenting people. And it's certainly helping young people to devolve in their social skills. and it's tearing the fabric of our connectivity.
And in a strange way, this digitized presence that we're encouraged to put out, which is an extreme form of visibility, when you actually look at it very carefully, it is actually a form of invisibility too, but of the worst kind, because there you are putting out this digital image of yourself. And here you are behind it, living the difficulties and the beauties of your own life. But this is not what is visible. The real thing is not what's visible. So in a strange way, what we take to be visibility is actually the worst kind of invisibility. Again, like I say, unlike the brilliant designer of the cover of Astonishing the Gods, who made the title in reverse, it's everything has gone to reverse. What seems really bad is much better than we think, and what's really good is what appears to be really good is actually really bad for us. I think we need to reverse. I think that the secret at the heart of Astonishing the Gods is a realization that sometimes civilization pursues an idea for 2,000-3,000 years, and in doing so, the idea goes all the way right round from its original benign beginnings, and tapers off with time into something that seems to be the opposite of how it began. And you see this in the history of ideas. You see this in ideas of religion. How it starts with great beauty, and then in the hands of people later on who pursue power, it becomes something else, and then later on it's used to persecute and so on and so forth. Just the way in which one beautiful idea through time can seem to turn around and become the opposite of what is originally intended to be. This fascinates me, and visibility is one of those things. I think we have. I think there's a link for me between our terminal relationship with visibility and what we're doing to the planet. And the very fact, for example, that many politicians who are climate deniers keep asking for tangible evidence in front of them of this problem seems to me to be itself part of the problem, because like cancers, like other really toxic conditions, by the time it is visible to you, it is too late. We really need to recalibrate our sense of what invisibility is.
That was an incredible point about how the visibility in media that is presented is inherently a falsehood, because either the way that we're presenting ourselves or the way that we're presenting the truth online, not just online, but in other news outlets as well, is by definition a performance, right? The performance of ourselves more than it necessarily can ever really be ourselves. Because as soon as you present yourself with an audience in mind, there's something that some of the authenticity kind of drops out of the image that you're presenting. So,
and some of your truth immediately becomes invisible.
Right.
It does, and then when you add, the lack of critical thinking, where you have a group of, the masses are used to predigested, content, predigested thought, where what's visible is taken at face value. I think we can look at the news today and see, or any day really, and see the outcome.
The news today is about that which has suddenly become visible, which actually, when you look at it quite carefully all this time, maybe had been visible all along.
Yeah, I remember, for example, when I was 7 years old, my father used to take me to this little, hole in the wall. It was a little pancake diner, little pancake house. and the folks there were Ukrainian. They had just fled from, a couple years before from the Ukraine. Their son was killed, and it's the same war. It's not a new war. It's the same war where it's picked up, where it's left off. But we sat there eating pancakes, and they were telling us all of the things that they had witnessed, and it's pretty much I can tear a page out and see the same thing today, which is a real tragedy. And we see these patterns repeated over and over in multiple countries and regions throughout the world.
But the media also itself falls into this dichotomy of visibility, invisibility, doesn't it? Something that appears in the media today appears in the newspapers and the news, television. This is what's happened today. It suddenly becomes visible. Now, when something else happens that is more newsworthy or deemed more newsworthy, this new thing becomes a new visible thing. And the thing that was visible yesterday now disappears, becomes invisible, and as far as we're concerned, ceases to exist. But meanwhile, all of these things that are supposed to be invisible are bubbling away and leading to their own consequences, which will at some point explode again in front of our screens because of this idea we have that something is only visible when we see it in a particular context. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, this is the state that we're in, and it's important that we recognize it and speak on it. It's a form of making something invisible visible, by recognizing that as an unfortunate fact.
So when you asked me earlier about the relevance of Astonishing the Gods being published in America right now, I think there you have it. There you have it. I think it's I think things I think books in translation, books that we translate that suddenly speak to us, books that we publish in our culture that have been available elsewhere for a long time but suddenly becomes available here where you are, they too have a kind of a relationship with what appears to be needed in a particular time. I'm fascinated by when a book is translated from another culture or from another place into ours, because that too has to do with visibility. That too has to do with making something that crystallizes for us, something that what was previously there doesn't quite crystallize for us. Books do that.
Yeah.
Books are very strange. They have a strange power to crystallize, and they do it through the network of themes that they operate with. It's taken 27 years for Astonishing the Gods to come to America, and I think it's very significant that it's finally here.
And I'm so pleased that it is. I'll take one moment now to remind our viewers that if you have questions for Ben or Morowa, you can leave them as a comment in the live stream that you're watching now. So I would go ahead and type your questions into the chat now, and we'll get to them towards the end of the discussion. But back to this. So as we were talking about a little bit earlier, it would be lovely to explore a bit more about how your two works, your two bodies of work, I suppose, have similarities between the two of you. And Morowa, if you can talk about a little bit, maybe how you felt when I asked you to be a part of this discussion. I know you have read some of Ben's work before, and
sure,
I'm very excited to have you join.
Well, I mean, there's the myth and the very multitude of themes that are covered in all of our works. I think the patterns that I see are such that Ben already described. And there's a sort of myth that we all draw from, There's themes that we all draw from. There's a frequency that we can hear in all of our work. One thing that struck me was the forest. I have a huge section about the forest and creatures of passage, the power of that forest, how it shape shifts according to who's in the forest, and what they see is according to the person and the spirit that they have, and whether they mean harm or good. So those types of things really speak to me when I read. I'm sorry, I got to bring up Famished Road because I always enjoyed marvelously those passages about the forest, the boy going into the forest, and the fear people had of the forest, but the reverence that they had for it, the things that went on there, and how it was slowly getting cut down bit by bit, piece by piece. I think that touched me a lot from the Washington that I remember as a kid in the 70s. And, you drive by some places and that huge untouched wilderness is gone,
Yeah.
And it hurts, when you know what was there, and then you see that it's gone. It really hurts, and you can hear the trees, crying. You can hear sadness, the silence. You can hear that sadness in the silence, in that absence. And so those are the things that really, speak to me, and I think are similar, especially when we look at your new work, Every Leaf a Hallelujah. It's every tree is a miracle, every tree is a God, and the child being able to recognize that and remind the adults of that is something that we could do in the real world as well, if we would just get back to the original respect that we had for the earth, that I believe we came here with. We were born with that, and that was beaten out of us, or we were taught to forget it. So our
I also,
stories
I
don't.
also, I also think, Morowa, just to continue something you were saying about the hurt that we feel when these trees in our cities disappear. I also think that the diminishing of trees and forests in our lives is also I don't think it's intended directly, but I think it also has the function of making it easier to control us.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's just an intuition I have that there's a relationship between the loss of forest, the loss of trees, the loss of nature, and the loss of selfhood.
Mm-hmm.
I always used to remember growing up in Lagos, when you went to different parts of Lagos, the poorer the areas were, the fewer trees, the fewer the evidence of nature there was.
Yeah.
The richer the areas were, the more the presence of gardens and trees and plants and undergrowths and hedges. And these two things, again, it's about visibility and invisibility. It's about the visibility of nature and the invisibility of nature, but in the worst sense. But these two things fascinated me. What does it mean that poverty and the denuding of nature go together? What does that mean? That it's almost as if impoverishment is not just impoverishment in terms of people's lives and the quality of their diets, but also in their access to nature. And I think the connection with nature, and I think the re-presence, the putting back of nature into the lives of the poor, into the lives of the deprived, might just be one very important struggle that I think can help to change something of the sense of lost freedom. I don't know. I just see a link between the absence of nature and the stripping of voices. I did a lot of reporting when I was in Lagos, and I did a lot of reporting going around the poor areas. I was always struck by this. Yeah, they clear the forests for the ghettos to expand. Why?
Yeah.
Interestingly.
You see that same thing in the urban sprawls here. You see the same, phenomena. Because of course, if you can control the environment and control the perception of degradation and, the sense of creating a world view of the people who live there, that this is your world and this is all there is, this concrete jungle and, defaced houses and abandoned buildings, and then that becomes your soul, that becomes your sense of place in the world, and it's poisoned. But yeah, I couldn't agree with you more with that sense.
Because in the villages in Nigeria, the forest was always close by, and you never thought of people as being poor there. It's interesting.
Wow.
That really goes back to the natural abundance of planet Earth, and how our presence on this Earth is what has created the scarcity, where in reality, everything that any person could ever need is abundant across the planet. And yet we have, I was going to say earlier, this reminds me of just last night at Lost City Books, we hosted a panel of experts on climate action. And one of the points that was kind of a consistent thread through was about how exactly what you mentioned, how the richest neighborhoods have the most access to nature, and the poorest neighborhoods are intentionally deprived by these systems created by those rich people in a way, because the corporations and the companies and the people who are enacting the most damage onto the natural world and onto our environment are the ones who benefit the most from impoverished people remaining not just financially impoverished, but spiritually impoverished and experientially impoverished, and impoverished from the natural bounty of the world around us. So I think you've both just made some very interesting points about that. So we have just a few more minutes. And I would love to close on a note about Every Leaf a Hallelujah specifically, because Ben, you mentioned that this is the first book like this that you've ever created. And so if you can tell us just a few things that make that true for you.
I think maybe it'd be better if I just read a little bit.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I think it'd be better. Well, here's Mangoshi. She's the name of the 7-year-old girl in the book, and she's made a journey with her friend, the baobab tree, and she's traveled in the universe of trees around the world, and she's found herself on the other side of the world, somewhere in Europe. Actually, it's in the south of England, and she's looking at these big trees. And she has her guide, the baobab tree, with her in spirit. She stared at the very tall trees all around her. One was so big and majestic that Mangoshi felt like an ant next to it. This forest is like a great cathedral my father took me to once, said Mangoshi. How do these trees grow so big and great? Ask the tree yourself, said the baobab. I'm sure she would like to talk to you. How do you grow so big and great? Mangoshi asked the big and great tree. The tree gave a wonderful laugh. We started small, like most things, said the great tree. And we draw love from the earth and draw love from the sun. We sink our roots deep into life. We support one another. None of us can grow great without the others. We don't compete. We help one another. We grow one day at a time. We have great patience. You will be surprised at the amazing things you can do with patience. I don't have much patience, said Mangoshi. My mother says that all the time. Patience is just another form of love, said the great tree. Love, patience is the love of life, said the great tree. You love life so much that you don't mind taking time.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And I can see what you mean by this book being for everyone of any age, because that the impact of those feelings, you know, it's very youth oriented, right? It's very a childlike feeling that you just described in that excerpt, but it's something that anyone of any age can reclaim and and reinvent as part of their mind.
Unless, of course, you're 105 and a half.
That's true.
Just kidding. I knew someone who got to 106.
Oh.
He lived next door from me. Every time I saw him, I asked him the same question: How have you done it? Yes, I felt like Mangoshi.
What did he say?
Oh my goodness, that's another story.
Okay.
But one thing that he did say and that he did do was he walked a lot. I mean, he was walking in the mountains of Austria up to the age of 95, 96, 97.
Wow.
Shocking. Yeah.
Huh.
He always climbed the stairs. He lived on the 4th floor. And every day he always climbed the stairs. He rarely took the lift.
Amazing.
That's
you know,
something to remember.
Exactly. I hope that'll be me in
Me too, if I'm lucky.
in a couple decades. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your thoughts and talking tonight. We can wrap things up today by, I'd like to ask you both, where can we find out more about your work? Where can we keep up with what you're putting out, and any other talks that you might have, or upcoming events and release related, etc.?
Ben?
Well, I think just check with my publishers, other press. They'll put out the information that you need to know. I've not been very good at putting out stuff on my website about where I'm appearing next. I really should, but I just spend all my time either walking, thinking, looking after family, or writing. I've never really got around to this. Yeah, but my publishers are very good at it. You know, they'll just go to their website and they'll tell you what I'm doing next. And I'm doing quite a few things.
We will definitely take a look. And for those of you watching, I will drop some links into the other press, into the chat for other press, so that you can keep up with them. And Morowa?
Well, I agree with Ben. It's a lot of work. But yeah, so it's Morowa Yejide, www.morowayejide.com, or Akashic Books. And there's links and info there, upcoming events and various activities.
Yeah, or look at my Twitter page. Look at my Twitter page. Stuff comes up from time to time.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you again both so much.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. Real pleasure.
Absolutely. This was a very stirring conversation. I feel like I learned so much, and felt so much of what each of you said. For those of you watching from home, if you would like to grab your copies of Every Leaf a Hallelujah and Astonishing the Gods, and we still have copies of Creatures of Passage as well. You can hop onto our website, lostcitybookstore.com, or come on down to our store. We're open every day for a good chunk of the day, 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. usually, if not more. Again, it was such a pleasure to have both of you. Thank you so much for coming. And
thank you so much.
Thank
Now
you.
look after yourselves. Have a great weekend.
Do the
Bless.
same.
Bye-bye, Morowa.